The French Encyclopedia, a systematic dictionary that included sciences, arts, crafts, in other words, a serious attempt to compile all the knowledge of the time. How is that possible? Well, it was an interesting attempt. It served its purpose, after all, because after the hard work of two intellectuals, Denis Diderot and Jean d'Alembert, published in several volumes between 1751 and 1772, the Encyclopedia or l'Encyclopédie summarized many of the findings that travelers, scientists, intellectuals had contributed with to the modern world at that time of ideas. The Encyclopedia was a tour de force. It was a masterpiece of the knowledge of the enlightened century, the illustrated century. The way in which it organized the knowledge was rational, was based on facts, was based on what that time was considered science. So the encyclopedia in many ways is the concretion of the spirit of the Enlightenment. All this knowledge, how can we be certain about something? Well, it was in print. Something that we now take for granted when we consult Wikipedia and other databases. Well, at that time, the difference might be that this was redacted, composed, and edited by two individuals who had a lot of knowledge themselves, so they could really distinguish what was worth of being published and what wasn't. This is something that we should keep in mind regarding research methods. Libraries and edited sources usually are more trustable. That doesn't mean that you won't find very interesting and valid information on the internet. Of course you will. But it's always it's good to have some form of filter. And the first filter, or one of the most important filters at its time, was the encyclopedia, the French encyclopedia. Diderot himself was a philosopher, and he devoted many years of his life to publish this wonderful text in many volumes. He embodied the secular rationalism of the 18th century. Now, the spirit of the encyclopedia wouldn't be possible without Diderot's and d'Alembert's hard work and their conceptions about reason as the center of knowledge and research. Another important enlightened author, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, of Swiss origin. Rousseau, who also lived in the 18th century between 1712 and 1778, had several treatises. The most famous one is probably The Social Contract, that argues that men, or human beings in general, are born good and free, but they have to enter some kind of social contract. Society puts limits and norms and in some way corrupts the spontaneous, natural well-being of people. So there had to be a middle point of agreement between that goodness in human beings and the imposition of the state in order to preserve that goodness and develop it. Other treatises like the Emile or On Education was a set of advices, of suggestions on how to educate, how to grow as a better modern person, his own confessions. In other words, Rousseau himself has such a vast array of works that was only rivaled by, for example, Voltaire, his contemporary. His literary name, Voltaire, corresponded to the author Jean-Marie Arouet, who lived also in the first part of the 18th century. He also died in 1778, just like Rousseau. But Voltaire was not just a philosopher, he was also a historian, a playwright, a satirical author. In fact, one of the most radical anti-clerical thinkers of his time. He adamantly proposed the separation of church and state. The state should not be ruled by religious belief, but by reason, by agreement, by political negotiation. Just as we think today, at that time it wasn't that easy to understand this new set of concepts. So Voltaire, in addition to writing the Candide or the Optimist, wrote several treatises attacking the church, and for that reason he was considered persona non grata, a non-deserved person in the religious institutions. Another contemporary of his, Charles de Montesquieu, a noble, his real name, Charles Louis de Secondat, Baron de la Brode et de Montesquieu. He was a baron, he was a nobleman. Between 1689 and 1755, the years of his birth and death, a political philosopher. His great work, The Spirit of the Laws, that came out in 1750, was of enormous influence in the conceptualization of a modern state, a state that wouldn't have to be ruled by aristocrats or the kings or justify the sovereignty of power based on religious belief. On the contrary, Montesquieu, Rousseau, Voltaire, Diderot, the French enlightened thinkers, as we know them today, they all advocated for a kind of government based on reason, based on forms of democracy, not just an abstract justification as it was before during the Baroque. Liberty, one of the allegories, representation of this abstract concept in the form of a classical woman from ancient Rome. This is, of course, a modern representation, but there are several depictions of liberty during the 18th century and also in the 20th century, as we can see in these French stamps that depict liberty in the form of a French woman with the crown with the laurel of triumph. Architecture in the neoclassical or enlightened century, the School of Law of the University of Oslo, again with the Corinthian columns, the triangle, and the frontis that more or less evokes, imitates a classical construction from ancient Greece. And a very well-known piece of architecture, the Arc of Triumph, or l'Arc de Triomphe, commissioned by Napoleon Bonaparte in 1806, precisely to celebrate one of his most recent victories in Austerlitz against his surrounding enemies. As we know, Napoleon took charge of continuing the French Revolution, but contradictorily he crowned himself as an emperor in 1805. But he expanded the borders of France, he gave France visibility that had hardly had before, and put order into the chaos that derived from the French Revolution in 1789. So the Arc of Triumph is inspired in the Arc of Titus, a Roman classical construction. Again, the idea that France would become an empire would be like the succession of the Roman Empire. The reference to the models, all this is pretty well known to you at this point. Classical, neoclassical, 18th century Enlightenment illustration is going to have a lot of commonalities with the Renaissance and obviously with the classical world, the ancient Rome and Greece, where after all the model of political democracy was born and was again renewed, remodeled, proposed again as the most just and rational way of political organization in the late 18th century and during the 19th century with the rise of the bourgeoisie and the debunk of the old aristocracies in Europe.